All right, let's move on to the next segment in this series. Last time we talked about multi-street strategy trees and an epsilon equilibrium example, and we're going to move into our draw balancing game as promised. So, the problem setup is pretty simple. We're heads up on the turn. There is a 100 chip pot, 160 effective stacks, and the hero has a range that's 1/3 nuts, 1/3 flush draws, and 1/3 open-ended straight draws. And the villain's entire range is medium strength hands that will always beat the draws unless they hit their flush or straight, always lose the nuts on the river no matter what happens. And so he's kind of got this merged range, and the hero's in position. And we can represent this with real ranges, as we'll see. But just from a conceptual standpoint, this is the setup, and it kind of parallels the Two Streets Natural Era bluffing game that we looked at from my Theory of Winning video series. In that, we had, 100 chip pot. I had the stacks of that as 150. I'll explain that, why I changed that numbers a little bit later. But the hero had this range that was half nuts, half air, that could never improve to beat the villain's range, and then the villain had this medium strength hand. And so that's what this game looks like with no outs, with no opportunity for the hero's air to improve. And what we saw was that it was never correct to bet a merged range into a polarized range in that setting. And that's something that's generally true and people have known for a long time. You say you don't bet your medium strength hands because they only call with better. They never fold worse. They never fold better. They always call with better. They never call with worse. There's just no value to be had, no bluff opportunity to be had. It doesn't make sense to bet. The optimal strategy was that villain would check and hero would bet small on the turn and follow through with a river all in. And what we saw was that line let the hero kind of compound the nuts, where he could bet on the turn as though a higher chunk of his range was the nuts than actually is, because he would be able to know that he'd be able to bluff shove that on the river. What about with outs? How does this actually change it? Before we look at the solution, I want to make some intuitive guesses and kind of get our brains thinking here. So I'm going to ask some questions. I encourage you guys, once I've gone through them, to pause the video, take a minute to think, and come up with some logic for yourself as to what the answer to these questions might be. Question 1, is this a better or worse spot for the villain than the pure nuts or air game from my Theory of Winning series? In that game, the hero's range was half nuts, half air. In this game, his range is 1/3 nuts, 1/3 straight draws, 1/3 flush draws. So the hero has the nuts less often by 1/3 versus a half. But now all of his draws have equity. His straight draws, and flush draws are both going to improve on the river and win sometimes. And it turns out that if you actually look at the villain's equity, just poker stove it, his equity in the nuts or air game, of course, is 50% because he's ahead of the air and behind the nuts. And his equity in this game is going to be like 53.8%, slightly higher, but just barely. His equity is about the same in both games. And all that's really different is the potential strategy changes that having these hands that might improve induces.